Good morning to you. My name is Nick Gowing, main presenter for BBC World Television, and let me tell you that if by any chance you are watching BBC World this weekend when you're not here and you see me doing a debate from Cape Town with the World Economic Forum on Zimbabwe, yes, it is me, although I'm here. We recorded that last weekend with the World Economic Forum. We have an enormous amount to get through in the next hour here about managing threats to Asia's prosperity. All of you will probably have your own views on this, but my job is to make sure that the 6 guests that we have on the platform, we have as much time to hear from them and to engage with you as well. What I'm proposing, therefore, is this. We have 60 minutes, 6 people. That means 10 minutes per area, roughly. There is a little bit of overlap, but there's also a lot of discrete difference between each of the areas that my guests and the panelists are going to raise. So my proposal is this, that we're going to hear from the first 2 ministers first, and then I'm going to open it up for any of you to intervene. I warn you, I will not be coming back necessarily to the subject, so please get that microphone, don't sit on your hands verbally, and get your ideas over, because we want to go through a number of areas, not just is there going to be a financial shock, issues like the complexities of Doha, issues like climate change, issues like indifference, complacency, and unresponsiveness, and rising inequality in the region. All of those are complex areas, and it's difficult if we try and mix them all together. Hence my proposal over the next hour to try and make sure we can get as much lift as possible from each of them in separate areas as we go through. So that's how I propose to manage it. I've asked them all to turn their mobile phones off because there are a lot of radio waves in here, and you'll be aware of the interference we got earlier. So if any of you don't need your mobile phone on as well, could you turn yours off too? Let me first go to Minister Sissangan from Thailand, the Finance Minister, and ask you to give us your view. I've asked everyone to speak for no more than 3 minutes. It's bullet points. Minister.
Thank you. I guess it's because Thailand started off the financial crisis in '97. That's why I'm asked to go first. But anyway, having read the Global Risk Network report, I think it's very interesting, and it brings me back to basically some of the reasons why we got into the crisis 10 years ago in the first place. First of all, at that time in Thailand was overconfidence, and we can all say that if there are certain risks that you're overconfident about, then of course it creates the greater probability that eventually that will lead to a crisis. Secondly, basically wrong policies. Because with certain risks, if you follow wrong policy, instead of making it better, it actually make it worse. In the case of Thailand 10 years ago, basically, our policy was the typical Mondale impossible trinity, and we followed that to the letter: fixed exchange rate, free capital flow, and trying to pursue independent monetary policy. Thirdly, of course, when you have the wrong paradigm, at that time, I think the authorities were looking at the problems in terms of potential current account crises, whereas in fact the '97 crisis was a capital account crisis. And with the wrong paradigm, you didn't really see the dangers until it was basically too late. And finally, in terms of not having the adequate data to really be on top of the situation. Now, if we get back to today, basically the risk to a country like Thailand stem very much from the same source as 10 years ago, which is basically very volatile and large capital flows stemming basically from the global imbalance. If we ask, with the global imbalance which has been going on for some time, what are the self-correcting mechanisms? Unfortunately, really, you cannot see any self-correcting mechanism. It seems like East Asia is simply accumulating these deficits from the United States, and the more they accumulate, the more they want to protect, to make sure that the value of US dollar does not decline, because otherwise all the central banks will be in problem. So we are moving basically in a situation where there's no real correcting mechanism, and hoping that one day the market will perform the correction. But as we all know, it's like when you stretch elastic band, if you let the market correct the mechanism, then eventually it will snap, and therefore this will bring about huge amount of economic chaos to the world. So I think this is where East Asia does have a major role to play in shaping the direction of global financial system. As the region which holds most of the world official reserve, the way these reserves are being managed can affect exchange rate, can affect interest rate, can affect yield curve. But unfortunately, we have not really performed enough of a leadership role in this area in the past, but this is something that to be explored in the future.
Minister, thank you. It would be strange if I didn't ask you this question, given what's happened in your country in the last 9 months. How much is what's happened with the intervention of the military and the new political structure you have and the action of the Supreme Court recently against the Thai Rak Thai party, how much is that threatening the chances for Thailand's prosperity?
Prior to the coup, basically, society was so pro-aligned. Really, half of society was very much pro-Thaksin, half of it was very much anti, and there was a danger, really, of a major clash. At the moment, we hope that when we get to the election towards the end of the year, we would get back to some kind of more normal political situation, where there's no major polarization in society.
But the disbanding of parties ordered by the Supreme Court as well, a threat to prosperity or not?
These are legal matters. I mean, together with the cases against Prime Minister Thaksin, these are legal matters, and therefore it will have to take the judicial course. But we hope anyway that after all these events, if we can get back to a more normal political situation, then I think confidence will come back, economic development will accelerate, and it will solve a lot of our problems.
Minister Tharman from Singapore, the Second Minister for Finance.
Well, let me take as my point of departure what Chan Lon Pop has said about the global imbalances and say something about what's happening in financial markets. I think we're seeing a very significant build-up of risks in financial markets. There's a high degree of complacency coming out of a very long period of a low interest rate environment and a low volatility environment. But seasoned observers, those who have been around long enough, know that a shock is very likely to come at some point. You can't predict when it's going to come, you can't predict its scale, but there's a feeling that when it comes, it's going to be pretty large impact and going to be very difficult to manage. We're all worried about liquidity, about the very large amount of global liquidity, some of it coming out of Asian imbalances that's sloshing around in global markets and is leading to bubbles everywhere. Bubbles in stock markets, in real estate, in commodities, even in private equity. There's a search for risk for higher yields, a search for higher yields. Emerging markets are a significant recipient of global liquidity searching for higher yields. And I think it's piling up the risks of some sort of tail event. And the tails are getting fatter. A tail event meaning something that's not very likely to happen, but when it happens, it's going to be, because of a fat tail, going to be a very significant event. If you look at the emerging markets now, if you look at Asian emerging markets, capital flows are back to where they were 10 years ago, before the Asian crisis. Very large, something like 6 or 7% of GDP. It's much better than it used to be because it's not about short-term bank lending. It's now largely portfolio investments in equity markets and bond markets, and it's about foreign direct investment. But you still have to watch this very carefully because the risk of an unwinding in global financial markets arising from an increase in interest rates in particular is going to have many unpredictable effects. What we have to wait for now is not so much the known unknowns, not so much things like the prospect of an American economic slowdown or an American consumer starting to spend less, but the unknown that comes along every few years. And it could be a pretty vicious unknown with an unwinding that's unpredictable in global financial markets. We can't predict how this contagion is going to play out, given the amount of leverage in the system, given the interlinkages in the financial system that are much more complex, much more intricate than ever before. We really can't tell how this unwinding is going to play out, but it could be substantial, and I think emerging markets have to brace themselves, have to put in place the shock absorbers to deal with this sort of event. No silver bullets. It requires astute management. It requires a range of policies rather than one single policy. Exchange rate policies can't be purist, but we've got to be on our toes.
Tharman, thank you. Would you, if you'd like to intervene, would you get yourself a microphone quickly? I'm going to ask one question to Tharman first. We've heard these kind of bleak prospects and predictions about the American economy. We've seen it about Europe, but still things are powering ahead. Are you just being a doom-monger? But I like your phrase, vicious known unknowns. So we've taken the Rumsfeld phrase one stage further to a vicious known unknown.
No, unknown unknowns. No, I think it's precisely because everyone's feeling good that we know something is coming. You look at all the major shocks of the last, not just 10 years, but 20 years. Not a single one of them was predicted. 1987 stock markets, September 11th, all the major shocks, the Russian crisis, the Asian crisis, classic example, totally not predicted. Things were going well. Everyone was feeling happy. But seasoned observers know that there are risks that are piling up in the system. We don't quite know how to put our finger on it, or we don't know how it's going to play out. But let's be a little more cautious. Let's realize that asset markets that go up eventually come down. And let's keep our eyes open and look at the bubbles that are forming around the world today, including in Asia.
Well, I'm sure all the delegates are feeling great this morning on a Sunday morning. How many of you feel that a shock is coming, or want to disagree or agree with either of the ministers? Anyone want to intervene? I can move on very quickly to... Please, yes, microphone here, please.
Pratap Nambiar from KPMG. You would assume I would comment on that. Now, I do agree it's the old saying that when the taxi drivers are beginning to become positive and starting to put money everywhere is the time when you want to look out for. It's the time when you expect shocks. What I would like as a question is, we looked at the Asian crisis, and while we did not predict it, there were some trigger events which we did recognize, but we ignored. Can we not look at those trigger events even today, likely scenarios for the unknown unknowns, and those trigger events can help us as we go along to identify them?
Anyone else want to come in? I can't see any hands. No? Ministers, both ministers. Minister.
Well, as I said, the main thing is to have the right paradigm. I think normally when crisis happens, because we're looking at things from the wrong paradigm. And in this case, I think a lot of analysts see the imbalance, the dangers, but somehow there's not enough of an effort to really try to deal with it. Maybe there's too much apathy, or maybe it's just a helplessness saying that we cannot do anything. But eventually I think that it's an issue where, particularly as I say in East Asia, maybe ASEAN Plus 3 group, which holds, as I said, most of the world's foreign reserves, it's something that we need to maybe discuss about how we can, as a group, help to unwind the global imbalance.
And Minister, given what you've been through here with SARS and the resilience you have created, you have problems or concerns about dengue fever at the moment, there's the Asian flu issue. Do you feel on balance that when it comes to those kind of perception and health risks, that even something like that is no longer quite as much a shock? The unknown unknowns, or the vicious unknown unknowns that you are concerned about?
Well, it helps to prepare for these things in advance, so you're not caught completely by surprise, and you've got some absorbers in your system. SARS caught everyone by surprise, but how you respond to it is very important, and how you respond to it is not a matter of chance, but a question of whether you've got a system in place of doctors, of scientists, of government administrators, or working tightly together as a team. And on financial markets, I think how we respond to the prospect of a major shock coming along at some point is a question of now and not waiting for it to happen. It means exchange rate systems have to start evolving. We're not in a world where we have the luxury of choosing either fixed exchange rates or perfectly floating exchange rates, but the sorts of managed float systems that are in place now across Asia are, I think, the most intelligent way to go. But there's probably still a little too much fixity in the system, where exchange rates are a little too fixed, and as a result, massive amounts of domestic liquidity are being created as a result of capital inflows. And this is what's fueling asset bubbles.
Anyone else want to join the conversation? I can't see any hands going up at the moment. Neville, do you have a view, or Rajat, do you have a view on these two particular critical issues?
I would agree with what the minister has said, but I think we should also see for the last 10 years, I think there is a much better institutional arrangements in place. The rules and regulations which probably didn't even exist are there. The question will be implementation. So I may be perhaps a bit less pessimistic on the vicious unknown unknowns and just talk about unknown unknowns, Mr. Minister. But I think one needs to be prepared. But I would take a more sanguine view of the ability of the system and your ability, sir, to be able to handle it.
Neville.
Well, I actually gave some homework to the ADB at the ADB meeting in Kyoto. That's basically countries need some guidance about how they can manage the capital flows. And so far in the international community, unfortunately, there's not been enough research on this kind of issue. So I asked the ADB in particular that maybe they should put more effort into it.
James Riady, you are Chief Executive of Lippo. Your remarks build very much upon these concerns in terms of the preparedness of this region and almost the complacency in this region.
In the last 3 years, I've gone to Davos, and I cannot but be impressed how optimistic people are. And I think there are many reasons to be optimistic. I think there's unprecedented wealth creation, economic growth, advances in technology and knowledge. People talk about human rights and democracy, environmental protection and so on. But I think if we have a more critical eye, we can see also that the world faces a lot of problems, and I think Davos also addresses that. You have the problem of a lot of wealth creation on one hand, but extreme poverty in so many pockets of the world. You've got the AIDS problem is still there. You've got the pandemic, the bird flu. You've got this armed conflicts around the world. You've got terrorism. You've got global warming and all the problems that comes with it. And even the basic foundation of our society, the families, are breaking down. And you've got immorality. You've got all kinds of problems, and these are all real issues. To the extent that right now in Indonesia, for instance, we face all of them. Tsunamis and earthquakes and all kinds of things. So these problems are real, and I think it gives a threat to undo all the progress that I think that mankind have made. And I agree that it is actually this building up. So I think for corporates like ourselves, the problems that we face every day are not the technical, scientific issues, but it's all the social, political issues that comes with it. For instance, of course, we are watching very closely what's happening in Thailand, for instance. It gives us worry, actually. How come in this age something like this can happen? But anyway, I think I agree that the problem is the complacency. It's the sense of indifference. It's a sense of unresponsiveness. And because of that, the education also is not being adjusted to that. The education system in Asia today is still focuses on the same old thing. And it graduates students with a philosophy of just being rich and happy, rather than having an eye for all these deeper problems that the world faces.
Are you being a bit over-pessimistic, though, given we heard this morning from the Trade and Industry Minister of Indonesia about how things have turned around there, given the enormous physical challenges in Indonesia? We heard from President Arroyo as well. History of economic lethargy is being turned around now in the Philippines. Surely that's about responsiveness when there is adversity.
I think the business community are optimists, but I think we need to just see two sides of the coin. We need to see the reality that a lot of progress, but also the other side of the coin is that there are a lot of problems that needs to be fixed. And I think it starts with our mindset. That there are problems, we cannot be complacent, we need to be more sensitive, we need to address the human infrastructure as well, but change people's mindset.
One of the issues you're talking about is empowerment.
Yes.
What impact do you think that is having now?
I think with globalization, governments are forced to rethink the way that they manage their countries. They are forced to rethink about how they are doing versus the other countries. The whole concept about growth, not enough to grow just 4 or 5%, but have to grow at 7, 8% just to keep up with the population growth. So I think there is a real pressure building up, for governments and for societies to change the way they manage.
How much do you see governments being aware of just how significant this threat is? I come from a country where we'll have a new Prime Minister on Wednesday, and Gordon Brown has said, and he said this several times, he said that we as political leaders don't realize that we're getting behind the power curve of public pressure. Is it the same here in this region?
I think people are too comfortable, especially let's say in many countries in Asia. In Indonesia, for instance, we are endowed with so much rich natural resources, and because we have a large population, just going along with the flow will grow us 4 to 5% per annum. But the key is to generate more investments in human infrastructure and physical infrastructure so we can grow 7%, 8%. And 4 or 5% today is not enough.
Who'd like to intervene and disagree? One question here, please, one microphone. Anyone else, please put your hand up because time is marching on and you'll complain that I haven't got to you otherwise, please.
Thanks, Nick. Nick Francis, Cool Energy from Australia. I think there's a really interesting thing that's happening as I hear this debate. One is that if you take climate change as an example...
We're going to come on to that in a moment.
But it's about risk. It's about this conversation. So you were saying vicious risks. It could create vicious weather risks. We could see things that we're not expecting. And then at the same time, it's a risk that's there. We have, in terms of prosperity, the opportunity with Kyoto and the clean development mechanism to create massive amount of inward investment into Asia. Most of that money is coming here. So you've got a real opportunity in terms of prosperity, but it's bound up in bureaucracy, a Kyoto bureaucracy and then national bureaucracies and corporate bureaucracy trying to engage with it. How much of a problem is the bureaucracy within companies or in governments getting in the way of us taking these risks and dealing with them as economic opportunities? How much does the lack of risk in the system make it difficult to get in front of these potential vicious risks?
James.
To be honest, I did not quite clearly get the question because the sound here is not so good.
Yeah. It's about whether you think that the systems, both the corporate and the government systems, are good at taking the risks that are necessary to cope with the fast-changing dynamics.
The identity of countries and companies is how do we, our ability to respond to changes around us and how we would allow changes around us to form us. So I think that would separate between the better players and the better performers.
Let me ask both ministers then, Tharman. Responsiveness, understanding the speed at which things are changing now.
Well, I think the key is to be transparent in everything we do. And the first issue is transparency with your own population. That's the way in which we respond to things that happen unexpectedly and build confidence in a population that we're not trying to hide things, we're going about it together with you. And over time, I think people know how to judge systems and governments that deal with issues transparently. It gives them added credibility.
Neville?
I think at the senior level is about leadership. And I think that's what the questioner was actually partly referring to. From a business standpoint, I think that leadership is understanding the new role of business and society in the 21st century. And if you go back to Friedman, in the last century, his view was that the role of business was purely to make a profit. I don't think that's sustainable if we are going to maintain the social license that we need to exist in the world which is faced with all of the issues that we have. And I think part of that leadership is leadership which engages not just with governments but also with responsible NGOs in terms of addressing these issues together. I think you've heard Carlos talk about this in terms of how we address climate change, that all the players need to be involved in responsible engagement, because the mechanisms that are there to solve these problems are not in the hands of just one player. And I think that it's related to a level of complacency as well. But unless senior leaders in every one of the areas understand that they have a role in addressing almost every one of these risks, and that includes business as a whole. It is not only about profit. It is about what we do for society. It is how we build that social license, how we remember that The value that we add back to society is what allows us to operate.
Well, let's pick up that principle on climate change in a moment when we've heard the Japanese intervention. Yes, over there. Sorry, I can't see you very easily.
Yes, my name is Jack Sim from the World Toilet Organization. It's very obvious that if East Asia is taking the U.S. deficit, the most obvious thing is to nurture and breed new customers. And at the bottom of the pyramid, there are a lot of poor who are going to be rich if you make them healthy and productive. So sanitation is a major issue that is totally neglected. And yet it is a preventive medicine that could make people healthy and productive and able to produce more. You are predicting bird flu problems, AIDS crisis, but the number of people that are dying of diarrhea is just tremendous, and nobody is taking care of that. And once you can take care of the sanitation issue, you have a lot of spin-off effect, and you can have new customers here in Asia. You don't have to rely so badly on the American economy to grow.
Right. Can I just park that for one moment, because Rajat's going to talk about rising inequality, and we were hearing earlier from the minister from Singapore about this real challenge of urbanization. Can I just park that for a moment, if I may? Anyone else want to come in on this? Otherwise, I'll move on. Yes, there is you're going to have to put up some paper or something, because I can't see you because of the lights. The microphone in there, please. Thank you.
Lionel from...
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Lionel from Ross, Singapore. Just wanted to add a question to the discussion, which is on the brain drain. People are the main driver of prosperity in Asia and everywhere else in the world. So again, in tackling with the prosperity issue, how are we addressing the brain drain in Asia?
Can I ask all of you then, this is a critical issue, brain drain, the capacity and the skills of a labour force at every level. Minister.
I think we're now in a phase where one of the greatest pluses for Asia is in fact what I would call brain circulation. That's not my own term, it's been used before. But brain drain was an event of the 70s and 80s, and we're now really seeing a return of quite a substantial number of people, Asians who went off to the States in particular to do graduate studies, worked for a while and are now coming back. If you look at what's happening in China, in Zhongguancun and other industrial parks, if you look at what's happening in India, a good part of it is fueled by returnees, the sea turtles as we call them in China. People who are armed with technology, with a knowledge of how Western systems work, about how universities work closely with industry. That's a great plus in Asia today. So we're not afraid, and we shouldn't be afraid of what was in the old days called brain drain. What we should be concerned is about how we can maximize the brain circulation, where we not only get our own people back, but we get people from all over the world to come to Asia, be part of the most exciting story of this century.
Rajat Nag, do you have clear data on this in the bank?
I take the view that we shouldn't worry about brain drain. It's brain quality of human skills is like any other commodity. It will go where the returns are highest and the opportunities are most. And I fully agree with Mr. Tharman that that is exactly why brains from Asia went abroad and are coming back, because the opportunities are better and more appropriate to come back to this region. And that's what will happen.
So you're not seeing this as a threat to prosperity?
No, we see that as a very positive development, and I would emphasize it is not just the native sons and daughters who went. I would welcome everybody to come and contribute to the biggest story of the century, as the Minister said.
James.
In my group, we address the issue by having the right mentality of multinationality. That means every resources that we need, we go globally to source for them. And we've not had a problems to try and attract them. At a price we can get them. But at the same time, I think we've been encouraged because there's been actually more and more people we can get. The problem is that I think we're growing much faster than the pool of talents that are available. And I think what our biggest concern longer term is that the educational system is still it's not responsive enough to the new world that we are entering.
Right, I'm going to pause this part of the discussion. Let's move on to climate change, because Masaharu Kono, who's the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for Japan, has come here via Tokyo from Heiligendamm, from the G8 summit. The G8 is now chaired by Japan. the critical issue of climate change and the expectations, the message from the G8 summit, and how the political leaders are going to match this enormous pressure now, particularly in the developed world, on the need for action. How is this going to be reflected in this region?
Thank you, Nick. Well, I was supposed to make some comment on brain drain and others, but well, I'll like to
please do.
Well, later on. Right?
Would you like to just...
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm fine. But,
I'll come back to you.
I'm very much... your word of vicious unknown is very impressive to me, and actually that is the issue which we are facing. Well, gentlemen, I would like to ask you, what is the risk right now, or what is the threat? Well, it used to be a lot of conventional risks are still there. However, the risks which we are facing at this is in the world. This is invisible risk. Well, your business, financial risk, and those are in a sense very invisible. But we'll look at the current world, as you already mentioned about. If I name a few, terrorism. Well, we cannot see any terrorists. It's invisible. Well, for example, the natural disaster, tsunami, and those. This is exactly invisible. And pandemics, you mentioned about bird flu, SARS, and those are. We don't know any intention of those germs. And this is invisible. And finally, also the climate change. This is invisible. And, well, of course, it is visible sometimes. If you look at the film made by Al Gore, you can see some visible things. But we're living in this kind of world. It is rather invisible. So, well, sanitation is also relating to those natural disasters and pandemics. So those are the risks and threats which we are facing at this stage. Well, then I'd like to say a bit about the G8 process also. But that is actually the reason why we, the nation state, cannot handle this issue only by one country or bilaterally or one company or others. But this is the issue of the sub-regional issues, regional issues, and maybe the intercontinental issue. That is global issue. Therefore, we have to mobilize all different kinds of energies and resources to tackle with those issues. This is invisible. Well, one of the aspects is that this is such a complicated issue because this is technical issue, this is scientific issue, and also this is economic issue, and political issue, and social issue. So that is a reason that makes us very interesting and very quite a challenge for us to tackle with. And also this is a transgenerational issue, I think. This is the issue for the next generation. Well, technical issue, I would like to say that as you are in the business company, and this, I think, from the viewpoint of we need certain innovation, as I hear the leaders' discussion on the importance of innovation. But innovation should be the very crucial key. As long as we make full use of the current conventional technology, we cannot overcome this issue. So we need some revolutionary technology to address this issue. So this is an issue on technology and where there is a business chance. And well, how to make use of technology? There is a world market on this issue, so this is a market issue too. Well, some of the parts of the world, this carbon emission or the CO2 it has its own price. So as long as there is a price, this is a business issue at all. Business issue. So I'm saying that this is a technical issue, technological issue, economic issue. But what I would like to tell you this time is that this has become finally a real political issue. I saw that 10 years ago when I accompanied my Prime Minister, I witnessed that there is a very heated discussion among the G8 leaders. Well, if you look at the history of the G8 for the last 33 years, it is very, very rare for those leaders to have some negotiations, heated discussion, and coming into the conclusion, fortunately, a rough idea of setting up the process for the future and targeting the date of 2050 and try to decrease the carbon emission by half at least. Those are the kind of messages which came into the conclusion. But I was so impressed that the first time in the G8 history, maybe virtually, first time for those G8 leaders did a real negotiation among them. Well, okay, maybe I will spend much of my time, but I would like to say just one word. Well, each leaders in G8 made a very humble, very constructive contribution, including your Prime Minister made a very wonderful intervention to make different positions into one. And my Prime Minister also made a very humble contribution based upon his own idea of Cool Earth 50. And then my Prime Minister Abe's idea is very much in line with the result of this discussion. And well, but gentlemen, I'd like to say that next year Japan will host the G8 summit, and there will be a one-year process. But this issue, although I said the invisible and transgenerational issue, but it has an urgency in it. We have to make an urgent process. We have to come to the common understanding among major carbon emitters by the end of 2008, so that we can come to the successful conclusion of the agreement itself, inclusive of major carbon emitters again, India, China, Indonesia, Australia, and others by the year 2009, so that we can come to the good framework after post-Kyoto, means 2013. So this is a sense of urgency. In Asian front, Asia-Pacific front, we have an APEC meeting coming up in September, and we have a major carbon emitters meeting, United Nations initiatives. Then in July next year, Japan, most of you may not have heard about the place, but it's Toya, Hokkaido, where my Prime Minister is going to host the G8 summit. So it's a very intensive process is going to happen. So we have to pay a lot of attention to this. We, the Japanese government, is as a chair for next year, we are determined to do that. Thank you.
I want to explore the implication for business models in a moment, but from you, from the political side, as the Sherpa for the Japanese government, how would you characterize the mood among the political leadership of both the developed and the developing world now, that if this is not confronted and mindsets are changed, there is a massive threat potentially to prosperity?
We would like to change a kind of a paradigm on that discussion. Nick, you mentioned about developing countries and developed countries. But this should be the issue of the major carbon emitting countries. Well, if you say loudly of the developing countries, then some of the key countries in developing regions will unite together and do some negotiation with the advanced countries. That is not the issue. This is not the issue to be handled in that way. That is, I think.
Let me pick up, Neville, with you, and again, let me invite you into the conversation as well from the audience. The business that you mentioned about social responsibility now, the 21st century corporate model, picking up what Carlos Ghosn said earlier today, the critical issue of the environment. If there is no credible resolution, it will restrain investments. Now, how do you see it from your major corporate position about how you embrace this as a threat to prosperity?
Well, I think there's a narrow business element, and I'll deal with that quickly, and that is you need to look at the footprint that you leave in terms of what you do in your own business, and you need to address that very responsibly and very aggressively, water being the prime one that we look at. If you take it into the broader societal context, it is what I mentioned earlier about bringing all the elements together in terms of government and NGOs and businesses at large. If you deal with the broader threat, one of the fears that I have is that economic nationalism or even business trying to take advantage from their own narrow standpoint will get in the way of solving what is an urgent issue. What do I mean by that? If you take the issue now with regard to ethanol that's coming from corn, I don't believe that there's been a systemic analysis, a proper systemic analysis about what it actually costs in terms of producing that ethanol. And therefore we get into narrow debates and we get prescriptive regulations coming out about supporting specific technologies. I think the issue has to be to identify the risks, to set the targets, and then to challenge people in terms of coming with a range of innovations that meet those individual targets. If you take water, we've set a target for ourselves, and that is that we want to be absolutely water neutral. I made this at the WWF meeting in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. In other words, putting back in everything that we use. And if everyone can do that in broad terms, then individuals are going to come up with the right solutions. The danger is that it gets into self-interest and it gets into economic debate, and we get prescriptions that are counterproductive.
We're talking about mindsets here, Neville. Is it a profit multiplier, the embracing the challenge of climate change, or is it a cost generator?
I think it is, at the end of the day, a profit multiplier, but I think I would be more dramatic than that. I think it's a profit essential, because if we don't do this, we are not going to have the social license that we need to operate. Our economic system, which has taken so many people out of poverty, which is the way to address some of the issues of disease, etc., will be threatened by other elements of society, and we will be in a debate which I think will be destructive rather than constructive about seeking the right changes.
James, how do you embrace this, given the enormous lift there has been literally in the last 6 months, particularly from the bottom up, one has sensed in the developed world, including in many states in the United States, against the federal government, many cities. Can you see this happening now in this region, and therefore being a prosperity multiplier as opposed to a threat to prosperity, climate change?
I think by and large, these governments are seeing the trend, and they're going along with the trend to empower these various players, and at the same time build up all the different institutions of society. And I think our job would be to encourage that further and be patient and contribute towards the whole debate.
But you have a series of business models in your enormous portfolio of companies. Are you changing your mindset? Are you changing your approach to doing business because of the clear political message which is coming not just from the G8 or Al Gore, but right across the spectrum from the UN, IPCC?
I think our mentality should not be because we are forced to do so. I think we should grow in our hearts that, that's part of our responsibility. We would want to do it anyway. For instance, like in Indonesia, when we build a hospital, the government prescribes that 20% of the beds must be subsidized. But I think the way that we look at it is that, look, we would want to do it anyway. So we've gone about in a very positive way of designing our hospitals for that.
But picking up Neville's point, a critical phrase there, a social license to do business in future.
Yes, I think we must recognize that the stakeholders are no longer just the shareholders. So I think when you get acceptance and endorsement from the whole spectrum of society, you need to accept that with a sense of responsibility.
Anyone else out there who wants to engage? Yes, please, at the back. And I'll ask the two ministers as well.
Ravi Kumar from Consistent Singapore. My question here is, I feel that there's a focus on fundamental research is missing in the region. And there is a study showing the brightest students even in Singapore prefer to go for arts and economics rather basic science and engineering sciences. So how to meet the expectation of these top brains, making them contribute to the prosperity multiplication through fundamental research resulting in innovative results?
Okay, I didn't hear that very clearly. Please, Minister.
I think governments would welcome companies with corporate social responsibility in many areas. But certainly you cannot just leave it to the corporate sector. I'm a tax collector. So basically, I think there's some room for restructuring your tax system to encourage the kind of behavior that you want. In our case, I think as a middle income level, we're at a stage where society is now putting a lot more weight on environmental issues. So we now can be moving more towards introducing some taxes that would encourage, environmental friendly activities.
Can you be more specific what you're thinking about here? Will that threaten Thailand's prosperity if you start doing that? How will that go down publicly?
Well, you cannot just measure prosperity by GDP number. For example, if the environment in the cities are very unhealthy, in fact, it creates a lot of costs in looking after the health care of the people. So basically, you have to begin to balance. And I think as a country with now enough resources to earmark some of it for these activities, to get environmental friendly action from the corporate sector, is something we're now exploring.
Minister, as well, from your position here.
I think from the perspective of a country that's just a city, Singapore, a city-state, there isn't too much of a contradiction between wanting to be economically competitive and vibrant and wanting to have a clean and environmentally friendly environment.
And are you taking the public with you on that message?
Well, I think so. a place has to be livable, and has to be extremely livable if you want to attract talent and if you want your own people to stay with you and to feel good about being in the country. And I think that's always been part of our strategy in Singapore. Keep the city green, bring green amenities down to the neighborhoods, not just in the upmarket neighborhoods, but where the common man lives. Bringing waterways, cleaning them up, down to the doorsteps of the common man. That's been very much Singapore's strategy. It's the way in which we retain political support for the government, but it's also the way in which we keep Singapore a very livable place, a place where talent from all over the world would like to be. So being environmentally friendly isn't necessarily at odds with trying to stay competitive in economic terms.
There's an interesting comparison with Hong Kong at the moment, where the level of pollution is rapidly rising because of southern China. And of course, much of what's produced in southern China is produced by companies who are based in Hong Kong. Yet it's now making life in Hong Kong quite difficult. And many people are saying, why is it getting so bad? Does anyone want to just intervene again on climate change at this point, on social responsibility? I know you've spoken once already. Anyone else who would like to come in? Okay, well, microphone here quickly. On climate change.
I'm one of the West social entrepreneurs, and one of the things I think to inject it, I completely agree with your point that this is about social responsibility, but we had $10 billion worth of investment into Asia in terms of, from Kyoto, it will be $50 billion within 2 years. Some of the biggest IPOs out of China have all been renewable energy IPOs. This is huge, huge business, and I think if we get that, and we combine that with our sense of why we should do it, we actually can shift our economies quite radically, and it's not an either or. I think if we put them together, we're much stronger, and I don't quite hear that in the debate.
Masaharu, you wanted to intervene earlier, but again, this pickup from business, this awareness of the social license, will that help you when it comes to the politicians who have to deliver under the G8 presidency?
Yes, we are now here. This country, as you call it, clean and green, right? Clean and green. But at the same time, as Nick mentioned about the situation in Hong Kong, and Japan is facing some problem with our neighboring countries of this climate change have a certain impact upon. Sumatra fire will make a certain impact upon, negative impact on Malaysia. So those are the situations. Well, all in all, in Asia, we are maybe a conventional threat is your neighbor, and also the new threat is your neighbor too. So those are the situations we have to overcome. Well, I'm very much encouraged. Well, you know, in G8 process, G8 in Europe, Nick knows there, but one of the issues which we have to fight against is Bono, or the NGO groups, how to deal with those NGO groups. That was the question. Well, the nature of the Southeast Asia is quite different on that viewpoint. So we need some government initiative to make further push on it. But I can sense it that as a driving seat, ASEAN is here, as the President of the Philippines said, that the safe driving, slow maybe, but steady driving should be a very important thing. And I can see that at the previous summits hosted by the Philippines, they start discussing about the climate change, and APEC will be coming, and also the ES. So together with those some initiatives of the government as a whole, together with some, Southeast Asian business people are very pragmatic in a sense, very, very pragmatic. So if there is a chance, they can do that. So a kind of a combination between government action and also private sector's initiative, I think that things will be moved toward a better direction.
Let me just press you on one thing though, Masaharu. You are a civil servant. You work for political leaders who are voted into power. Those politicians have to reflect the wishes of a majority of the population, a significant number of whom work for corporations and in the private sector. Those who at the moment are prospering from not taking much notice of climate change. Can you see that mood changing very fast in this region?
Nick, you may have to see another next development of the next 5-6 years. We are still in the process of the first Kyoto process, and the government of Japan has made a commitment to decrease by 6%. We are now struggling. We are now working very closely with the business sector how we can achieve this initial target. Otherwise, our credibility will be tested. Therefore, we are now in that process, and we are fighting very hard, and we're negotiating and also collaborating very closely with the business sector.
Right. Let me move forward with two other critical issues in our last 15 or 20 minutes. Neville, you have a concern about the threat to prosperity, a specific issue here, building on the discussion we had in the first session.
I guess the headline is the Doha round, which obviously is in extreme difficulty as we sit here today. And I believe that business and also the governments around the world, apart from some who have been in the lead in the disagreements around the Doha round, have forgotten what's brought us to the level of prosperity, this unprecedented level of prosperity and growth that we are achieving at the moment. And that there is a reliance now maybe coming through that bilaterals are the way to go. Bilaterals don't work on the same rule-based system as the WTO. They're actually preferential agreements. And that out of this, we may be moving to a period of rebirth of a level of economic nationalism. And the fourth point I will make here, that is also reflected in terms of non-tariff barriers that arise to trade. Free trade is what has allowed the global economy to grow, and I think that to the government members here, to ASEAN in particular, as we sit here in Asia, that there needs to be a renewed effort to try, and it won't happen in a hurry, but certainly be sure that Doha is not taken off the agenda. It is part of the enabling mechanism to solve a number of the issues, in fact, that we've discussed here today.
Repeating very much the message of the first session with a degree of gloom, does anyone want to specifically come in on that issue of economic nationalism and the Doha round? Is this about this issue? Please.
No, allow me to get back to the climate change issue.
Can I leave you for the moment?
Okay.
Because I've got to just get two more interventions in, please. Just be patient, please.
Okay.
Anyone else want to come in on Doha? I can't see a hand going up. All right. Rajat, you have been very patient by agreement, and you were quite happy to go last, but not in any way pushing to the end this issue which you want to raise of rising inequality. Can you address as well the issue we had of urbanization earlier, the rapid urbanization, and that particular issue on sanitation and the concerns about that?
Yes. I think all of us would agree that rapid development has brought enormous benefits to Asia. So what you see in Singapore or Jakarta or Mumbai, the glitz of it is real. Asians certainly are healthier, better educated, better off than a generation back. But I think there's a very major risk to sustaining prosperity in Asia by what I call the two faces of Asia, which are increasingly diverging. Let me just throw a few figures, and I'm sure it's no surprise to any one of you. 1.9 billion Asians today live at $2 a day or less. $2 a day. 2 billion people in Asia today have inadequate access to sanitation, 700 million inadequate access to clean water. Some social indicators in Asia, the prosperous Asia, are actually worse than sub-Saharan Africa. We believe that this rising disparities in Asia, while one Asia is growing and growing very well, the other Asia, which is falling behind, has in itself the seeds of some very major social tensions which will translate into political tensions, which actually can threaten the entire prosperity that we're seeing. And therefore, the two faces of Asia, we believe, needs to converge rather than diverge, which is what's happening. Asia is becoming richer, but is also becoming more unequal. And I think that the political leaders, the corporate leaders, all of us have to deal with that issue of rising inequality and these two faces of Asia, which you are seeing across this continent.
What would you say, though, to the argument that this is an opportunity to generate prosperity?
Absolutely. I think, we believe very strongly that economic growth is the best way to reduce poverty. We're not talking about redistribution in any way. But I think we have to think of inclusive growth. We've got to think of growth which pulls people up. This business of rising tide lifts all boats is predicated on one key assumption, that there is no boat which has a leak or a hole. And if boats do, and they do often have that, then I think the governments and society at large has to pay attention to make sure that those boats at the bottom can also be lifted up. So it has to be conscious public policy choices of encouraging growth, but also making it inclusive so that the people at the bottom are also benefiting.
Minister, growth which is inclusive, is that something you feel confident you can produce in Thailand?
Well, in the broader context, if you look at Thailand, our neighbors to the east, to the west, to the north are countries at lower levels of per capita income. And so I think for Thailand, it would be of Thailand's interest to see our neighbor grow more rapidly. Because at the moment, for example, we have something like 1.5 million undocumented migrants coming from neighboring countries working in the country. And so, in fact, when people ask me, what about Vietnam is growing very fast, I say I'm very happy for Vietnam to be growing very fast, because we need to lift the incomes of countries who are neighbors up. Of course, we want to grow at our natural rate, which is maybe something like 6 to 7%. At the moment, we're around 4%. So we still have some work to do to get back to our normal rate. But I agree that the disparity issue is certainly something very important.
Rajat, is there clear modelling which you have got in the bank or other economists have got to show how growth can generate and lift people, or does it exacerbate that divide that you're highlighting?
It could, unless you make sure the public policies recognize that you have to invest in social capital. Therefore, you have to invest in primary education. You've got to invest in primary health. You've got to make sure that the infrastructure that you're putting not only focuses on the expressways, which is very important, but also rural infrastructure. So yes, public policy choices have to be made to make sure the benefits go to the weaker segments of the population.
Let me ask two corporate representatives. James, do you see, do you believe that the kind of massive portfolio of interest that you have does generate wealth and lifts people, or does it further divide them?
I think it does. It does.
It does what?
It does lift the standard of living of people, but I think more can be done, a lot more opportunities, and I think the corporate world is still learning through this process how it can do a better job.
Do you see yourself having a social responsibility then to try and alleviate some of this inequality?
Yeah. I believe that what is needed is a new generation of leaders that understand what education is all about and spend money on education. That's why for my own group, we are taking it not reactively, but in a proactive way to invest heavily in education. We feel that by doing that, we can lift up the whole, we can change the situation.
And Neville, as part of this social license you're talking about, not just climate change, but this kind of thing, how does an enormous corporation, multinational like Coca-Cola, embark on this? Do you feel you have a role in lifting those that Rajat is highlighting?
We do. Let me go back to the basic. You're looking for evidence. I think it's very clear that the closed economic societies are the ones with the mass of poor people. The open economic societies are the ones that have social inequality, but certainly at the bottom end, not as many poor people. So you've got to look at it actually in two dimensions. So there's clearly a political disconnect if you have too many people who are disenfranchised from the growth that takes place. But you've got to get the growth in the first place. So I think sometimes we get the two confused. So that's the first piece. The second, therefore, is that economic growth is what allows the generation of what are essentially governmental solutions. Education is absolutely at the key. Last night, I don't know if she spoke about this morning, but the President of the Philippines was very clear that as she privatizes a number of her industries to make them more efficient, that money is going into education, because it is education that is going to be the greatest enabler. What we can do as we grow our businesses is ensure that we help that in some way. We do invest, she talked about it last night, in building what we call little red schoolhouses. So one of the things that we do in the Philippines is to actually build schools so that the teachers can teach in a proper environment. But that's a small additive to a problem which is essentially governmental and one of governmental leadership.
Right. I know there are two hands. The gentleman at the back still has the microphone, I hope, and two ladies here, so there's three. Please.
The discussion of the climate change, particularly the target of the reduce the carbon emission by 50%, remind me of our experience in 35 years ago when the United States introduced the very tight emission control for the automotive, what is the Muskie Law. So what I would like to stress here is that which is very important, just 50% is not insufficient, and each specific sectors, automobile or factory emissions or in the global scale, this specific target should be introduced and make it to the...
All right, that's quite a technical issue. There is a session later in the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
So can I suggest you raise that, because we're talking about broad brushstrokes here on prosperity, generation or threat.
Yes, this is I think that every private companies, they make the best effort to clear the tight, regulation, then innovation will become. And as we see in the 30 years ago, that the more dynamism in the industry. That the winner here might be, in this case, that they are not necessarily a Japanese automobile industry, could be Korean ones or Chinese ones or ASEAN ones. This is what my comment.
Thank you very much. Two more points here, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Goying. This is Kuniko Inoguchi. I'm a politician from Japan. I'm a member of the House of Representatives of Japan. And on this question of growth with inclusiveness and globalization and social coherence.
And threats to prosperity.
Yes, threat to prosperity if there is a divide. I think that is exactly the challenge for the political and business leadership today. While politicians and business leaders come to World Forum or international negotiation platforms to negotiate global rules, at the same time, political leadership must address common people's understanding of the global risks, challenges, and missions. Minister from Singapore talked about on the doorsteps of common people. Today, politicians and political leadership and business leadership face two-front agenda. One is to participate in global rulemaking, but on the other hand, we have to help common people understand those questions and help them cope with their own capability to cope with those questions and help them come to terms with the reality. So I would like to ask ministers from ASEAN how they do both of these roles. One is to really participate and make an impact in global rulemaking. On the other hand, you have to talk to people, common people, and get their understanding and get their capabilities to cope with those questions.
Right. Pass the microphone back. That critical issue, challenge for every politician. How do you lead but reflect what the people want? Someone.
Well, that's politics. I mean, that's the definition of politics. If we don't carry the majority of the population with us, then we don't survive. And I think the majority of the population is becoming a very discerning one, a very sophisticated one.
Is that because of information technology?
It's because of information technology, and it's also a product of success. As you succeed in educating people, they become more discerning. They scrutinize your actions, and they know when you're just talking or when you're really doing things. And across Asia, I think populations are now looking at governments to see whether they're really doing the things. And I think that's a very positive development.
Minister, you've only been in office a short time. Are you feeling that cold wind of trying to manage the balance between what you need to do and what the public expect?
Well, I don't think about it too much. But of
Don't
course,
you think you should?
Of course. But I think that the main thing is to somehow get some things to the people in a way that's very close to them. In Thailand, of course, if you look at our media, usually it's simply domestic coverage. But for the people, I mean, they work for foreign companies, they meet with tourists and so on. So if you try to get them to understand how Thailand relates to the outside world through the activities they're close to, I think then there's some hope that eventually they can pay more attention to the kind of bigger picture that we want them to have.
Thank you. One final point, please.
My name is Wu Qing from China. I work in the NGO sector as well as a politician, democratically elected. My question is that when we talk about growth and prosperity, do we have a human face? Do we have a human face there? I'm talking about women, children, as well as the elderly, the handicapped. So when we talk about growth and prosperity, we are only after numbers and percentages. I'm thinking of each individual, especially with China. We've been having dramatic changes and big growth, and yet the gains are not shared by women or peasants and the migrants. So I think the most important thing is we need leaders with global perspectives, with the rule of law in mind, to guarantee that each person can share what's been stated quite clearly in the United States Human Rights Chapter. So and I think with China, with our Constitution, it says every single citizen should enjoy. So I think it's most important for leaders to have that in mind with a human face. And when we talk about inclusive growth, sometimes it's very vague. We want human development and with a human face. Thank you.
That final point about growth and prosperity with a human face. James, it's almost what you were talking about with your indifference, complacency and unresponsiveness.
I think the problem is that we often have growth, but that there are other people left out. Then you've got the problem of inequality. Many people in the developing countries are being criticized, saying that that's because of corruption and so on. We believe that the biggest threat is bad government policies. And so bad government policy hits the wide spectrum of all the people, particularly at the lower levels. So I think the government must make good policies. Now, having said what we've been saying, I think we have to be careful that we don't leave this room thinking that the burden is in the corporate sector. The main instrument of doing away with inequality is fiscal policy, fiscal instrument. So I think that's often not being used.
I'm being waved at to bring this to a close, sadly. Rajat, growth and prosperity with a human face.
I think they're certainly not mutually exclusive. I certainly agree with what Neville mentioned, that growth is an absolute prerequisite for poverty reduction. If you do not have growth, you're not going to basically achieve anything. The important challenge for the public policymakers, the corporate policymakers, is this trade-off, but I do not believe they're mutually exclusive. And I must say that I'm leaving this room with much more optimism than maybe when I entered, because I've heard the public leaders acknowledge the issue, the audience, the honorable member from China acknowledge the issue, and I think if we all focus on that as a threat, we'll be able to deal with it. Of course, if we ignore it, it'll come back to haunt us.
Masaharu.
Just a few words of in relation to what she said and also this climate change. One very important aspect is that this is the issue of adaptation also, not only mitigation but adaptation. What's going on right now is the poorest of the poor are suffering from this climate change issue. Therefore, this is not the issue in the future, but that is the reason why I'm saying that this is the imminent issue. Access to energy. Looking at some poor village, poor women and children, they are the first people to be suffered from this climate change. So that's the reason why we have to take take the things moving as soon as possible. That's what I'd like to respond to what she said. Thank you.
All right. Look, sadly, I have to bring this to a close because lunch beckons, but can I thank you all very much indeed. We did have that rather deep foreboding from Tharman that the vicious unknown unknowns, but we have Rajat ending saying he leaves with a degree more optimism than when we assembled an hour and a quarter ago. Thank you all very much indeed.